All right, thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Amanda Harris and the center here for the invitation to come speak to you. I have had the good fortune of seeing many of these talks myself from the Stillwater site there and know what terrific speakers you bring in, and certainly hope that what I have to share lives up to those standards. I want to start off by giving a few acknowledgments here. None of the work I'm going to talk about today is my own. All of this is done in collaboration primarily with a whole bunch of awesome graduate students I've had a chance to work with over the years. Some are pictured on the slide there. Ignore what's on the table in front of them. But many of these folks have contributed to the work I'm going to talk about today. I'll also mention that I was told 45 minutes is kind of the goal for the talk. I will tell you that I've prepared enough material for either 30 minutes or 2.5 hours. I have no idea which. We're just going to proceed on and see how it goes. When you're asked to come and talk about your work, many in the audience can identify with this. It's hard to edit out and leave out any of it because it's all brilliant, you think, right? But I'll do my best to keep things moving and cover a lot of ground here. As Mike mentioned, I'm a clinical health psychologist. In our lab, we study basically health habits, the things that people do that put their health at risk over the both short-term and long-term, and how we might go about interacting with people to change some of those health habits, which turns out to be quite a difficult problem. We're kind of a broad range kind of a lab. We've studied HIV treatment adherence. We've studied how providers interact with patients around health behaviors. We've done some work with tobacco, and most recently some work with hookah or water pipe tobacco use, which is becoming very popular. So we do a lot of different things. What I'm going to talk about today, to narrow it down a little bit, is probably the most consistent thread that runs throughout my research program, which is work with college student drinking. All right, shocker piece of information here to start off with. You might have heard college students sometimes use alcohol. Not asking for a show of hands. I just know that folks are generally familiar with this. The stuff on the slide here captures some of this, how it's just a part of our college culture, perhaps for as long as colleges have been in existence. Alcohol use has been part of that culture. We do know that many college students use alcohol. In fact, most college students use alcohol at least some of the time. On most campuses, the scope of the problem is not quite as widespread as people think. On most campuses, it's limited to about a third of students drink in a really risky way. The ones that I study in my work, we're really worried about the quantity and frequency of their use puts them at risk for all kinds of consequences. About a third of college students, in addition, use alcohol some of the time, but generally in a non-problem way. They may use alcohol occasionally in relatively smaller amounts, not much of a problem. And what's a surprise to many college students is about a third of college students don't drink at all. They're complete abstainers for a variety of reasons. We'll talk about the guesses students make about that a little bit later in the talk. Also, perhaps not surprising to you, I'm going to go back one here. Perhaps not surprising to you, alcohol use on campus is associated with all kinds of associated problems. It puts students at risk, particularly those third of students who are drinking in a more risky way, more frequently in higher quantities. They're at risk for all sorts of things, and there have been some estimates in recent years of some in the neighborhood of 600,000 injuries annually. By the way, those injuries are not all by the drinking college student, him or herself. Many of the consequences are experienced by the non-drinking peers on the campus. Perhaps as many as 700,000 assaults annually. 400,000 students have unprotected sex, including about 100,000 who are too intoxicated to remember whether they consented or not to that sexual activity. That's a huge problem. And probably most alarming, estimates are around 1,600 to 1,800 deaths per year in the U.S. on college campuses are associated with alcohol use. One of the news stories here is just a year ago we lost a freshman at OSU to an alcohol-related accident. Just to give you some context for that number, that's quite a large, alarming number. That's more of our bright young people being lost every year to their interaction with alcohol on campus than it was lost in any single year in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So it's a pretty surprising, alarming statistic. So somebody should probably warn them, right? Usually when people hear about this, the first thing they think about is we should yell it from the mountaintops, we should make sure every college student knows about the dangers of alcohol. And certainly at this point, we probably have about a 50-year track record of pretty aggressive education campaigns to try to get at this public health epidemic of alcohol use on campus. You know, slick graphics, advertising campaigns, commercials on radio or television. We do all sorts of things to try to raise awareness about this issue. Sometimes we bring crashed cars to campus, which are heartbreaking and emotive. But one of the things that we know is that this stuff generally doesn't change behavior. It may in the short term change some attitudes. It may at best be useful for preventing those abstaining students from progressing on to being alcohol using. It may make those who are non-using more committed to their ideas to not use alcohol at all. But for those high-risk students, those ones who are already using in a risky way, these kinds of things are not effective at all, and in some cases may do the opposite. They may actually make them more committed to expressing their autonomy and freedom by using alcohol in a risky way. So we've got to do something else. In some of the work I've done, we've studied why is it that these things aren't more effective, because it seems like logically, from a rational standpoint, these kinds of things should work. You tell people about the risks, they should act to avoid the risks. Why doesn't that happen? One of the things that social psychologists know about, we've studied in my own lab, is a process called defensive bias, which is one of the many cognitive biases we all have as we go about the world. Defensive bias can also be known as the preaching to the choir effect. You've heard this before, where and what we've shown in our own research is that if you take a risk message, in fact, we took a risk message created by the NIAAA, the experts on how to do this. They put together the best message they could for college students. We showed that message to both non-using and high-risk using college students. And what we found is that the non-using students see that message and they think, wow, this is a big problem. Something should be done. We should act on this. There's no policy we won't support. I mean, they see it. They get it. But they're not the intended audience, right? They're not the people who this is intended for. You show that same message to the students who are using alcohol in a risky way, and their reaction is something like this. Or they become really critical thinkers, right? They all of a sudden start taking apart the research that it can't quite be. You all may have experienced this yourself, by the way. How many remember about maybe a year ago, maybe last fall, when the World Health Organization came out and said bacon was a carcinogen and nobody should eat bacon? Y'all remember that terrible, terrible news? It was all over Facebook for a while. Well, you might have experienced yourself that if you are vegan or vegetarian yourself, or you know vegan or vegetarian friends, their reaction to that message was quite different from yours, possibly. Their reaction was, told you so, right, basically, and they were like, hell yeah, WHO. The rest of us who are not vegan and vegetarian, our reaction was something like, you've got to be kidding me. That can't possibly be true. Bacon is, sent from the gods. It's, that can't possibly be. One of my friends on Facebook said that they never saw their students so interested in understanding effect sizes as when WHO came out with a risk of bacon and a risk of cancer. So that was an example of a defensive bias effect. Bacon lovers didn't want that message, so they push it away. Those who don't eat bacon thought it was a terrific message. So that's part of the problem. Well, I'm not here today just to tell you about what doesn't work. I'm here to talk to you about some things that do work. And we know that there are some things that do work to help with this, some of which include environmental interventions, things like restrictions on availability, reducing the density of establishments near a campus, price disincentives, trying to do away with things like, I still can't remember when I was in graduate school at the University of Arizona, one of our favorite places to go, had a Thursday night incentive called Penny Till You Pee. Ever heard of that one? That was basically, you get as many beers as you want for a penny a piece, but when somebody stood by the bathroom they would slap a wrister at, and after that point you paid full price, right? And so what does that kind of incentive create? Fast, heavy drinking, right? I'm gonna get as much as I can in before my bladder bursts and I've got to go to the restroom. So those kinds of things are a bad idea. Trying to get rid of those disincentives is a smart policy. We know that increased and consistent enforcement of mandatory legal drinking age laws, DUI laws, do tend to have an impact as well. So there are some environmental, community, policy things we can do. That's not really the work that I do. I focus more on the level of individual interventions with the individual at-risk student, and some things we know work there, things like cognitive behavioral skills training, teaching students how to use alcohol in a safe way, the kinds of things that many students stumble upon sooner or later accidentally. We think it's a good idea to teach the relatively naive new rookie alcohol user how to do so in a more skillful and safe way. Expectancy challenges. One of the things we know about alcohol is that most of the effects of it, I don't know if most is a fair word, a big part of the effects of alcohol are related to placebo or expectancy effects, and challenging some of those effects does reduce alcohol use. The last thing that we have on this list is the stuff that I do in my own work, which is brief motivation interventions, which include what I'm going to call personalized feedback interventions. These three things here at the bottom are all things that are listed on NIAAA's website for college drinking as what they call Tier 1 evidence-based approaches. Just for completeness sake, the stuff I had up there earlier about just purely educating about the risks, that is on their list as a known ineffective strategy. So we got to stop investing so much money in that. A little bit about where PFIs come from. They weren't sort of like many good scientific discoveries. They were sort of found by accident, I guess, along the way to trying to develop something else. Many of you may know something about motivational interviewing, developed by Bill Miller, a brief conversational style of how to bring about behavior change in folks. Well, in the earliest days of that, he developed something called the drinker's checkup. Before it was even called motivational interviewing, it was the drinker's checkup. What that was drinkers, community drinkers, not college drinkers, would get an assessment followed by some feedback. And the main point of it, in Miller's eyes, was to create a topic of conversation for the important work, which was the conversation between the professional provider and the user. And so it was really sort of developed as something to talk about during the conversation. It wasn't meant to be the intervention by itself. However, starting in the early 1990s, and I happened to be lucky to be on the University of Washington campus when some of this was going on, a new approach called Brief Alcohol Screening Intervention for College Students, or BASICS, came out. BASICS was initially designed as a drinker's checkup type intervention for college students. They would do an assessment with freshmen actually before they arrived. Then when they arrived, they would have them come in for feedback, and they would have this conversation. Well, they got smart and started looking at, well, does the feedback by itself have an effect? And lo and behold, they found that it did. I do like to give credit to Gina Agostinelli in 1995, who was really the first I can find in the literature who actually did this kind of thing. Feedback alone is an intervention. She was doing mailed feedback at University of New Mexico and found it to reduce drinking among college students for a dissertation. And she really started off what became 30 years of research to follow, including my own. So a little bit about what a PFI looks like. It basically has two parts. The first is generally a comprehensive assessment of alcohol use and all associated behaviors and risk factors. So we certainly look at things like quantity and frequency. We look at normative perceptions, their guess about how their drinking compares to other people or what's typical on their campus, expectancies, motivational readiness, all sorts of different things that go with that, risk factors like mental health and family history. We then take that and we basically calculate stuff and reformulate it and then give that information back to the student in the form of an assessment report, personalized feedback that includes things like estimates of blood alcohol from their drinking experiences, both peak and typical drinking experiences. We compare their use to norms and their guesses of what they thought the norms were, which are often quite inaccurate, and correcting those inaccuracies can be helpful. We might give them summaries of consequences. We might estimate practical costs. This is where we will translate their use of alcohol into things like, well, how much money are you spending on this over the course of a semester or a college career? How many calories are you consuming? One of the fun things we often do is compare number of beers to number of hot dogs, because a single 12-ounce beer is approximately the nutritional equivalent of a hot dog. It has about the same calories. It has about the same, meaning no actual nutritional redeeming qualities otherwise. And most students would say, no way would I eat 20 hot dogs on a weekend. Gross. But they'll drink 20 drinks on a weekend that's approximately the nutritional equivalent. So we'll reframe the information they've provided in ways that help them maybe think about it in different ways and see things that maybe they couldn't see even though they were living it, because you just don't know how to do that. You don't know how to calculate estimates of BAC and these sorts of things. So you're trying to sort of give people information that they can't get otherwise. Some other common features of PFIs include the feedback usually involves graphics. We try to, as much as we can, show it in charts and stuff because it's often dramatic. They're typically delivered on paper or electronically, either on web pages or on tablets or through the mail or email. They may or may not be done with an interviewer guide. We'll talk some later about whether that might actually be necessary or not. And one of the other interesting things about these is they typically completely avoid any direct advice. So you never, as part of this professional feedback, say to them, here's all your feedback, and by the way, in my professional opinion, you should. We just don't. We just give them the feedback. We let them do what they will. That turns out to be pretty important. And we'll talk about some of why that might be. By the way, feel free to shoot up with questions at any point along the way. I don't mind stopping for questions. All right, so my lab has worked with a model for PFIs for a number of years that we call the Drinking Assessment and Feedback Tool for College. When I first came to OSU in 2000, one of the other sort of side missions of my lab is to figure out electronic adaptations of brief interventions to help them be disseminated more widely, delivered with fidelity. So I try to take things that a person can do and figure out, can a computer do it? You know, the John Henry Challenge. So we developed a computerized PFI that was designed for an at-risk student to be able to sit down with and within 40 minutes complete the assessment, get personalized feedback, and the whole thing was done. They're out the door. We don't have to see them again. One of the innovative things about ours was that it had a video interviewer. So we tried to capture some of those aspects of being person to person, where the video interviewer would pop up from time to time and talk to them, give them instructions about assessments, would tell them about how much farther they have to go, encourage them to continue. During the feedback portion, would explain the feedback, you know, give a little bit of explanation and whatnot. So we tried to have some aspects of it having a person contact the intervention, but mostly it was purely a PFI. Interesting, probably trivial thing here is that when we started developing this, we developed it not to be delivered over the internet, because back when we started doing this work, the internet could not reliably deliver video. You know, most of you in this room are too young to understand. Some of us were around when internet video was exciting and it was a postage stamp size and it was all pixelated and you had to wait for 3 minutes for it to buffer. Y'all remember those days? So those were the days in which this was developed. So since we had a video aspect to it, it was developed, designed to be delivered on a local computer, not by the internet, because we couldn't conceive of Netflix at that time, right? So that's what we had. By the way, that also means that the Draft CS today in 2016 is dead. Windows 7 killed it once and for all. Unless we can find a machine that is earlier than Windows 7, it cannot be used anymore. I've grieved it. It's over. It's fine. But we used it for several different studies. The screen on the right there is a little bit of what it looked like. See the video interviewer popping up here. He's about to explain some of the feedback. This is BAC feedback. This particular student was getting some pretty alarming feedback that their peak drinking occasion got them to a peak BAC of 0.30, nearly 4 times the legal limit. It wasn't uncommon for us to have folks getting that kind of feedback. And so what the interview would do is pop up and say, here's how to interpret this chart. Here's what this means. Again, not giving any advice or telling them what to do about it, just saying this is what this means. This slide also shows some of the different measures we use for quantity, frequency, risk factors, whatnot, and how we would translate that into a variety of different kinds of feedback. The closest we come in these kind of feedbacks to giving a direct advice is usually when we give the feedback about what we call protective strategies, about sort of ancillary behaviors that people do to drink in a more safe way, you know, avoiding driving, having a designated driver, alternating drinks between non-alcoholic and alcoholic, eating beforehand. These sorts of things that help reduce intoxication and make it more safe. The closest thing we come to giving advice is usually in the feedback portion. We list all of those things and we check off or highlight the things that they do. And that's kind of a sly way of saying there's some things you could do, right? But we never explicitly say, do these things. So I want to share with you a little bit about our findings for the Draft CS as a model for these kind of PFIs. And our experience really fits pretty well with the global literature overall. So our initial study, we simply compared the Draft CS to control group. In the charts I'm going to show you, they're all similar in that they just show baseline and follow-up. Typically our follow-ups were 6 to 8 weeks later, so we were usually about 2 months later. I also, to make it easier to see what's going on, I translated all of the data to % change from baseline. Of course, those were never exactly the same from study to study, so it got pretty muddled. This made it easier to talk about study to study. And the main variable we're looking at here is changes in drinks per week, which is their overall reports of quantity of drinking at both the baseline and follow-up. We measured lots of other things, of course. We measured peak drinking experiences, peak BAC, drinking consequences, motivational changes, all sorts of things. I'm going to show you % change in total drinks per week, partly because that's our main focal thing. We're trying to get students to drink less in a more safe way. That also helps us compare study to study. I can also tell you that in several of our studies, especially the early ones, we typically had longer term follow-up, 3-5 months or later. Usually what we found in our data, consistent with other people, is once this change happens in the short term, it tends to stay. So people tend to make a change that they tend to persist with over time. So a lot of studies don't bother with a longer-term outcome anymore because we just know from several studies that if you get this short-term adjustment, it tends to stay. In large part, what we're doing with these kind of brief interventions is trying to speed up what we call the maturing out effect. We know that many at-risk drinkers, by the time they graduate and go in the real world of being on payroll and having mortgages, they tend to become more moderate in their drinking over time. Our concern is we can't wait because there's a lot of consequences in the meantime. So what these kind of PFIs tend to do is sort of shift that trajectory earlier in the college career to where they start maturing out earlier, and it does tend to persist. So our control group, as you see, didn't change much here. We saw a nice change at the follow-up short-term in drinks per week of about 25%. So these students who had this 40-minute intervention were drinking about 25% less over time. That may not seem like a whole lot. We'd certainly like to see more. Keep in mind it's a very short intervention and doesn't involve any direct advice at all. It's just saying, here's who you are, here's what you told us, and we repackage it for them. But also think about a 25% reduction in drinking for these students is probably clinically quite meaningful. That 1 or 2 extra beers on Friday or Saturday night might be the difference between some really bad decisions and some good decisions. I'm not judging any of you, but we all, we can understand that a drink or two less sometimes could make all the difference between having a safe drinking experience and perhaps experiencing some really dramatic consequences. So we're generally pleased with that. Keep that 25% in mind as we go from study to study. Follow-up study we did, we thought made some sense to compare the draft to this kind of feedback with a live interviewer, the kind of drinkers checkup stuff Miller used to do. So we had a live interviewer who was trained in motivation interviewing to go through the feedback with the individual compared to the computer alone. One of the neat things about this particular study is we actually had the live interviewer and the video person were the exact same person, so that we were able to control for things like the likability of the interviewer or gender effects or whatever. Whether they liked that person or not, at least it was constant across the two conditions. And he was terrific at talking to students about this stuff. We also had in this study 2 different control groups, what we called minimal assessment and full assessment, because one of the things we know in these types of studies is that the assessment process alone tends to produce some positive effects, especially if it's a very comprehensive assessment. So we did a minimal assessment where we saw no change. The full assessment saw what's typically seen in these studies, what we call sort of a study reactance problem, if they actually change a bit just by the pure virtue of being evaluated or completing these assessments. Our draft didn't look quite as well. Remember that 25% reduction in the previous slide? We only got about a 10% reduction in this particular study. And look at the live feedback approaching that 25% reduction. So in this particular study, the live feedback did beat our computer, but we're not clear on whether that's because the computer seemed to underperform in this sample for some reason, or whether there really was something helpful about the live interviewer. I'm pretty convinced, as you'll see in the data we're going to follow later, that it was really about the draft underperforming for whatever reason. One of the nice things about the draft is it's perfectly fidelity. We know it did it right. We know the students got the exact same intervention as they got in previous studies, but that's what we found there. We also looked at comparing the draft CS to the draft CS plus some skills training. Both of these completely delivered on computer, no actual human or professional interaction. Because one of our ideas was perhaps we have some students who are sufficiently motivated by the PFI to change their behavior and drink more moderately. They just don't know how. They don't have the skills or ability to do that. So perhaps giving them some information may have some additive efficacy. What we found, I'm not sure why this one gets presented in such weird order here. We got the giveaway at the start. So our control group doesn't change a whole lot. The moderation skills alone, which is the other dotted line near the top, doesn't change any different than control. So simply telling them moderation skills seem to have no effect at all. The draft CS again, notice about the 25% reduction we see there. So we keep seeing that kind of consistently across studies. And in this study, it did look like for some students, it may have provided a bit of an efficacious boost to give them some information about how to do this, to give them some skills and some good ideas of if you want to drink more moderately, here's some good ideas of how you might do that. So in summary, those studies and a few others we did are pretty consistent with the overall literature, that PFIs tend to result in pretty reliable improvements in more moderate use of alcohol among at-risk students, and we're pretty encouraged by that. At this point, there's now in the literature, I think, in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 different randomized trials of PFI-like interventions. But it's a bit perplexing at this point because it seems that we get the same effects pretty much with or without the interviewer. In general, with or without skills training, although we saw a small effect in our study, other studies have not found that necessarily. The modality of delivery doesn't seem to matter much, whether it's delivered by the mail on paper or on internet or in real time on a tablet or a computer screen, doesn't seem to matter much. And those effects appear to be durable. So there's a lot of good news in that. But that leaves us scratching our head, right? The question is, these PFIs work for some of the people some of the time. What next? How can we make this better, right? And that's really what my lab and the field is really looking at right now, is how can we improve these interventions to get beyond that 25% to perhaps have some real difference. Some of the things that we are doing in my lab to try to look at how we might enhance the efficacy of PFIs is we're taking a couple different avenues to this. Much of this work has been done by one of my recent graduates, Mary Beth Miller, who I'm comfortable saying knows way more about this stuff than I do. If she was here giving this talk, I wouldn't miss it. She's now at Brown University. But we've been doing a lot of different things looking at the content, for one. Do we have the right content in these? I'll show you some data in a minute that there's not a lot of consistency across studies of what kind of content goes in the PFIs. Usually it ends up just being the judgment of the lab team that's creating it. Well, it sounds good. What could we throw in there? I happened to be at University of Washington when we added the calorie costs. And I'm proud to say that was my idea. And it was my idea because my background was in exercise science. And I knew that you could calculate costs. And in fact, we translated it, not only the hot dog calorie thing, but we also said how many minutes would you have to spend on a Stairmaster? Because we know for somebody's gender and weight about how much time they'd have to spend in various activities to burn off that. To some folks on campus, that is an important piece of information. But again, that didn't come out of any kind of theoretical idea or any kind of even asking students what they want to know. That was from us sitting around thinking, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we told them this? So I think we need to back up a little bit and think a little bit about content. I think it might be helpful to look a little bit at theory, and my lab has contributed a bit in that area as well. And one of the things many folks are doing, including my lab, is trying to enhance the clinical utility, getting this to people where they are, not having to come to labs, but can they get this in their primary care clinics? Can they get this in student health offices, on university websites, and whatnot? So a lot of folks are working on how can we package these things in palatable ways that students will use and interact with to expand the reach of these brief interventions from a public health point of view. So I'm going to talk briefly about each of these approaches. As I mentioned, there's a lot of variability in the content of these things. We found and looked at the literature, and my student, Mary Beth, identified all the studies that were out there and actually hounded all of those authors to actually get their PFIs. We actually had our hands on every PFI that was ever done to be able to look at it, be able to evaluate it, what their graphics look like, did they have graphics or not, what content did they have there. So we actually, this was from analysis of laying our eyes and hands on every PFI that was done. And we found basically there's 11 different things that are in some of the PFIs some of the time. But as you see here, there's relatively few of them that are in all or nearly all of them. About the only thing that appears in pretty much every PFI we've ever seen is a normative comparison. So these normative things tend to be pretty common. Also a drinking profile, giving people feedback about this is how often and how much you drink, and perhaps in many cases translate that in things like BAC, but not in every case. So there's 11 different things here that are done in some PFIs some of the time, but we don't have a lot of consistency. When I looked at this literature and I was thinking about other literature I look at, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I look at things like therapy outcome literature and whatnot. And I thought, if we had a therapy out there in the world that we were saying is evidence-based, and yet there was 30 different ways to do it, nobody did it the same way, we'd laugh people out of the room, right? But with PFIs, we've basically taken that approach that if you've got 20 labs studying PFIs, you've got 20 different kinds of PFIs being studied, and we need to take that a little bit seriously. So we asked a couple of questions about this. One of those questions we ask is, what do students want to know? Doesn't that seem reasonable to take a step back and think, what do students really want? What kind of feedback would be most interesting to them? So we did a study a few years ago where we actually took all of these different 11 types of feedback, and we created sort of standard ways of presenting them. So this is an example of they all sort of looked similarly, where we described what it was and what it might look like on a bar chart. And then we simply asked at-risk students, which of these would you want to know? Which of these would be most interesting to you, most impactful, would you be most curious about in your own, for your own self? And what we found was there was pretty striking differences. There was two things in particular that most students said they really want to know. They want to know something about the descriptive norms. That's lucky because almost everybody was doing that. So luckily, what we were doing in our PFIs matched pretty well what students actually want. What not everybody was doing, but students overwhelmingly told us they really want, is they want that practical cost information. That's that translation into money, into calories, that gives them a real sort of bird's eye, big picture view of what does this really mean? What does this translate into my waistline or into my pocketbook, right? Students really wanted to know about that. The rest of the stuff was all pretty similar. Individuals, some wanted, some didn't, but those two things really stood out. Keep those two in mind for a study in a slide or two. Now going back to this fact that all of these different things show up in some PFIs some of the time, but not all of them, one of the things that we observed is this created an opportunity for kind of a natural experiment. Now this natural experiment, as all natural experiments do, has all kinds of flaws. But one of the things that it let us do is it let us look at and compare studies that included that feedback to studies that don't, right? With everything except drinking profile and descriptive norm, because they pretty much all had that, with everything else we could compare. There were studies that included that information and studies that don't. And we could actually calculate effect sizes and see, does including that piece of information make the intervention more efficacious versus not having it present? So that was the next study that we did. And we actually found a couple things that were pretty interesting. One of the things that it turns out tends to be impactful is, guess what? Practical costs. Maybe partly because that's what students want to know. But it looked like from this data that if a PFI includes practical costs, it was about twice as efficacious as PFIs that did not include practical costs. So that turns out to be something we think is important to know. Another important thing pops up there in the middle is strategies. Getting feedback about strategies for more moderate use, what we call protective behavioral strategies, turned out to be efficacious as well, more than doubling the effect of studies that included that versus studies that did not. So from these two things put together, we were starting to get sort of an idea of the kind of ideal active ingredients for these kind of PFIs, both from an evidence perspective and from a student preference perspective. So my student, Mary Beth, thought, well, let's make a horse race. Let's compare those. I thought it was a pretty neat idea. This was a randomized trial. Many of these randomized trials were students' dissertations, which I can't believe I convinced them to do. But she did this one. So she had an assessment-only group. This was a group that simply got the pre and the post, no actual intervention. You see in this group about an 8% improvement. One of the other things we've done in my lab, I'm not showing you data about today, is we tried to figure out what measures lead to this reactivity. So maybe those are the measures we could leave out. Because when you're doing these trials, you don't like your control group to improve. It makes it harder for your intervention group to p less than 0.05, and right? So you've got this sort of problem. That study, by the way, was completely unsuccessful. We had like 4 different types of things, and they were all the same, reactants in all of them. So we haven't solved that question yet, but we have studied it. She also had a group that did norms only. So this was, and a couple other folks in the literature have done this, where the only feedback people get is here's what you drink, here's what you think other people drink, here's what other people actually drink. So simply norms feedback. It's usually like a 1-page, not a lot of information. So we included that because that has been done. That's the only piece of PFI information, to our knowledge, has ever been tested by itself. So we included a group with that. We then had the 2 groups that look at these 2 different questions, enhanced versus choice, evidence versus choice. So the enhanced group took those 2 things. All of these groups got norms feedback. The enhanced group got those 2 things that the evidence told us were important, practical costs and strategies. So they got 3 pieces of feedback. In the choice group, they got norms, plus they got to pick 2 other pieces of feedback from those other least to 10, right? Many students picked, consistent with our other data, many picked practical costs, but not nearly all of them. I think the most common thing picked by students was practical costs at about 30%. So the students in the choice groups were getting quite different interventions based upon what did they want to know. We said, you can learn 2 things from this, pick 2, and they would pick those couple of things. So norms only, look at that. See that number again? About 25% reduction in drinks per week from simply getting feedback about norms alone. All right, what happened to our other 2 groups? They're up there. They were identical. I've never seen data turn out so identical. I didn't know that these were so identical until I was creating this slide and rescaling these with that percent change, because they of course, with the real data, they're kind of not all overlap, they're like this, but when you express it as a percent of their baseline, they were all pretty much exactly the same. All 3 of these different interventions getting about 25% reduction in drinking. Now I can tell you that from this data, if you look at this drinks per week, it looks like there's absolutely no benefit of the other 2 options. I can tell you when you look at the bigger picture of the other data that we collected and some of the other improvements, there was some advantage for the enhanced or evidence-informed intervention over either choice or norms alone. And so our conclusion in this paper is that adding those two pieces of information don't hurt and they may help. They definitely don't hurt adding it to norms alone, but they might help just a little bit. All right, so that was some of the work we've done with content. Some of the other work we're doing recently is really looking at theoretical roots, because this literature sort of started out with just a sort of practical observation, hey, feedback helps, and then everybody tried to figure out theoretical explanations and some theoretical enhancements. During the 90s, a lot of the studies talked about theory. And then in recent years, studies have sort of gotten away from theory, and they're just looking at, freewheeling, what do we think works, And we think there's some benefit to theory and getting back to theory. One of the things we did is we looked at all of these PFI studies that have ever been done and what theories do they cite, what theories do they talk about that inform their interventions, and it's a whole bunch of them. How many are up there? I don't know, 12, 13 or so. There's a bunch of theories up there, and so it's been kind of all over the map. We think there might be some benefit to narrowing a little bit and focusing a little bit more. One of the things we were arguing in this paper is basically, let's pay attention to theory. Let's not just ignore it and freewheel and have horse races. Let's see if theory might be able to help us guide more effective interventions. One of the theories that happens to be one of my favorite is Carver and Shire's control theory, a theory of self-regulation. And what this theory is very simple. This theoretical model is very simple. It basically presumes that all of us in our self-regulation systems have a thermostat, basically. That's what this comparator triangle process at the top is. Basically the thermostat that says, that compares the information that's going on right in front of me to what are my goals and values, right? And when people experience a discrepancy, a conflict between their goals or values and what's actually happening, that tends to motivate a change to reduce that discrepancy that feels a bit uncomfortable. So it's kind of this thermostat. One of the things that I think PFIs do simply is they allow that process to take place by making stuff that is invisible reality to people. They're not able to see the calories, the costs, the blood alcohol level they're achieving last Saturday night. It's just not visible to them, right? There's no dashboard on their phone that shows them that. That'd be a great idea. Dashboard, okay. So there's nothing like that, right? So what feedback does is gives people the information in a way they can make sense of. They can then compare to what are my goals, standards, and values. In normative feedback, one of the things that we think happens is that students, one of their general implicit goals is, I don't want to be the weird one. I want to be like everybody else. And when they get feedback that your use is way out of line from what the typical student actually does, in that comparator process, that creates a discrepancy and a tension in that discrepancy that motivates more moderate use to become more like everybody else actually is. Does that make sense? I think paying attention to that gives us a lot of ideas of how we might continue to build on that to create different types of discrepancies. One of those discrepancies I just mentioned is this normative misperception. This is some classic data now about 30 years old that showed that demonstrated that individuals generally think other students drink more than them, no matter how much they drink themselves, right? If I'm the heaviest drinker on campus, I think most students drink more than me. And I think that partly belies that implicit goal that I want to think I'm normal, right? Or I want to think maybe I'm a little better than normal, right? I'm a little safer. And we know that doesn't happen. So norms is certainly one of those potential places, and one of the things we have seen some good success. I think there's some other places to go, and we have some studies ongoing right now that are looking at this. I'm not sure if you can read this at all. This is an example of a different kind of feedback we're giving right now, where we're actually trying to translate that normative strategy idea combined with these protective behavioral strategies. So we're giving students feedback, not just what we've always done, which is you do this or you don't, but we're also telling them 90% of students do this and you don't, right? We're telling, if they're saying that they rarely have a designated driver, and we're telling them 87% of students do have a designated driver, that gives them that comparator process to say, I'm a little out of line here. And maybe that'll motivate more use of protectoral strategies to become in line with what the norms actually are. That study actually just finished recruiting about a week ago, and so we're a few months away from follow-up data on that. Another thing that we're looking at is trying to identify how does drinking actually conflict with their values, with their actual core values. This is something in motivational interviewing we've known is an important strategy for years, but we've never been able to really capture it in the PFI kind of context without that interviewer present. And what we observed in my lab is there's no real measure of that, so we created one. We created a measure called the Valued Living Questionnaire for Alcohol Use. We took the Valued Living Questionnaire, which some of you may be familiar with from the ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy approach, has a Valued Living Questionnaire. Familiar to anybody? It's okay. Well, this is our measure. So it basically identifies all your different values, whether those be things like family, health, academic success, financial security. Identify your values. And it asks you, how does different things fit with that? And we ask in our measure, how does your use of alcohol fit with that? And so that's what we've done with this. We think this will be a way not only to measure outcomes, but also to give feedback to students about, these are your values, and alcohol doesn't fit. Again, for that comparator process, if they can see that my behavior doesn't quite square with some things that really matter to me, my values are the most valuable thing to people, that might motivate some change to make my alcohol use fit better with those values. I want to mention some of the values that we see are particularly important there are things like spirituality, health and fitness, education. Certainly alcohol fits with some values for students. Things like being social, finding sexual partners, those sorts of things. Their alcohol use finds it fits pretty well with those. But college students have lots of other values. They have goals, they have dreams, they have other values like spirituality, family, health, and fitness that on average students are telling us alcohol doesn't fit very well with those. And if we can make that more salient for folks that you've got these other goals too, and this might not fit, we can motivate some change there. So that's a future direction. A few other things I'll mention here before I close. I think I'm going to hit this 45-minute mark pretty close, which is kind of a miracle. Some of the things we're looking at are borrowing some things from social psychology, things like message framing. Should we frame these messages more as gains or losses? Message framing would tell us we probably should frame them more as losses because people are more loss averse. So instead of telling students, this is what you stand to gain if you drink less, we might be better off telling them this is what you stand to lose if you continue drinking like this. That's a theoretically direction to take. We don't know yet whether that would work or not. Things from behavioral economics like delay and probability discounting. One of the things that I got to find a new student who will do this for a dissertation because I like this idea. One of the things that we often do with practical costs, like for example with money, is we will translate it into some big number. So we'll say something like, you spend $45 a week on alcohol. If you were to take that $45 a week during your 4 years in college and invest that in a retirement account at a 10% return, at retirement you would have some ridiculous number like $600,000. It's ridiculous because of the miracle of compound interest. I mean, it's a ridiculously big number. But and that seemed to make sense to us. The problem is, and what behavioral economists would tell us, is that's not going to impact them. Why? Because it's a long ways away, right? It's so far away they can't imagine it. Yeah, it'd be great to have $500,000 or more, but that's 35, 40 years away for these young people. They're just not going to see that possible. It might make more sense to tell them you could have a new iPhone this year than to tell them you could have $500,000 at retirement. Does that make sense? And so I really want to do my next study is comparing practical consequences that have short-term benefits or costs versus those long-term consequences, because behavioral economics would tell us the less delay, the less discounting, it might have more impact. One of the other things I know some other labs are working on is increasing the salience of alternatives. My colleague Jim Murphy at University of Memphis did a lot of work with this, looking at if you're not going to use alcohol, you got to do something else. You still want to be social, you still want to meet people, you still want to have fun in college. So finding alternatives tends to be something that can enhance these PFIs as well. They're having some good luck with that. Last thing I'm going to mention here is some other applications of PFI that might be completely crazy. I'm going to out myself here as a potentially crazy person. As Mike mentioned, I'm department head of psychology and have been for 3 years now. And I'm, I guess, an evidence-based administrator. I'm trying to find evidence-based ways to improve the performance of my faculty, which is one of my responsibilities. I actually devised a PFI for faculty performance. You guys probably can't see this on the screen very well, but every faculty member every year gets an individualized PFI report on their performance in the past year compared to all of their peers. So we have all these metrics about publications, grants, impact factors, course evaluations, all this kind of stuff. They get feedback on how they performed. They actually get rankings. They don't post these anywhere. These are completely private to them, but they know if they're first or last or in the middle. And then they get information that helps them interpret it. You know, how close am I to the top? How far am I from the bottom? You know, if I'm last, how bad am I? These sorts of things. Because one of the things that I was observing is that we had a lot of a faculty who would get good teacher evaluations, say 3.5 on a 4-point scale for instructor overall. That's a good teacher evaluation, right? But a lot of our faculty, including myself, would get a 3.5 and think, I'm probably one of the best instructors in this department. Why aren't I being nominated for all the faculty awards? Why aren't I getting the big raises? Look, I'm getting almost a 4, right? When we started doing this PFI kind of stuff, what we learned is that 3.5 makes you below average in my department. Our average was about 3.6. And so it sort of made people sort of think, those people with 3.5 who may have thought they were doing great all of a sudden, some of them, because many faculty are competitive and want to do well compared to their peers, many of them may have thought, maybe I should innovate some. Maybe there's some things I should learn. Maybe I should update my class. Maybe I should do something different. And so those sorts of changes can come about. Again, I could be completely crazy about this, and some of my faculty, I'm sure, completely hate it. But this just shows you what a true believer I am in actually getting feedback and activating those comparator processes to help self-regulation and performance. Guys, I think I hit 45 minutes just about on the head, so we've got a little bit of time for questions.